How do you feel about the scandal going on with the Dr. Seuss books? Says Broken Teacup. I know very little about it, but one thing that I do know is that it's not as big of a scandal as people make it out to be. So the remarks that I heard around it is that there's some outrage about people or some curriculum removing the books. There's actually been a movement to remove or slowly phase out Dr. Seuss, and it's been going on for a long time. And some people, I don't know the specifics, but some older books, culture, to some of us, they're things from our childhood. We think they're precious. They do have some outdated ideas baked into them. And those things have actually been noticed a long time ago. And they've been slowly phasing them out of the school curriculums for a long time. And just something caught wind with it recently. And then people get all outraged and think that someone's trying to cancel it or whatever it seems. I don't know. I haven't paid much attention to social media as of late. It's funny because I've got I'm interested in these topics, and I've got my talkie channel where I like to talk about these things and offer some perspective. But at the same time, it kind of drains your energy to get in that space all the time, just going into social media and people are angry and outraged, and staying away from it is good for your health too. You don't have to look at the burning dumpster, or the dumpster fire, whatever the thing is that people like to say, the dumpster fire. The media makes small things look like giant problems, says Skrill. Yeah, they can do that. Sometimes, problems are valid and need attention, but there's a lot of good going on in the world, and social media just somehow takes up our attention and can make it feel like whatever the latest thing people are angry about is everything, and it's not always true. I think that you can appreciate things like Peter Pan without agreeing with its stereotypes of women. I'm not massively familiar with the story of Peter Pan. I mean, I watched it a couple of times when I was a kid, so I'm not exactly sure what you're hinting into there. But essentially what happens is that culture and the times change, and therefore things that were once, precious childhood stories for a lot of people become noticed as being outdated and sharing ideas that we supposedly no longer agree with, right? And then people start to try and phase them out. In mixed with cancel culture, though, it's very immediate, Peter Pan cancelled. I'm so outraged. The outrage thing is just not helpful. I think discussion and education and talking about ideas and how they change, and using some reason will share why some older stories, maybe Peter Pan's one of them, have some things in it that we don't really like as much anymore as a society, right? They just look too deep into it and then start speculating and then share those. A speculation circle, and then people start saying that it's true and all hell breaks loose. This stuff is true if you're going to pay attention to it, right? It's just these arguments come across in some of the worst ways. White privilege is one of those things where it's if you shout at someone, "Oh, white privilege, you and your white privilege," you've got a good chance of rustling their feathers and annoying them. Whereas if you take the time to explain the history of colonialism and a male-dominated world, and not make it someone's fault that they're a white male, it's a pretty agreeable thing that there is something going on there. For me as a white male, I don't feel like I've ever hit a boundary where I'm oh, this is because of my sex, or oh, this is because of my skin color. And it seems completely likely, based on many things that exist in the world, that can be a problem for someone. So I don't see it as a mythic thing. But when you have cancel culture and outrage and people shouting, white privilege, and they're angry, it's just going to annoy someone who's not. In fact, it annoys me, and I'm educated, right? On what this is about. But when I go and watch old movies, some of that stuff really hits you. The way they talk to women in some of the older movies, fetches a drink, doll, and all that kind of stuff. It's oh geez, that's just not on. And then sometimes you just notice how whitewashed movies are. I was watching this 90s movie a while back. I forget what it was, but the cast was just so every single person in the show was white, And the one time I saw someone of color, like they were a waiter, and it was just like, like there's something going on here. You can make a problem out of anything. It's a matter of opinion. If you want to fight for something, that's fine. Just be polite where you can, says Tides returning. Yeah. And I think what you said, like, it's a matter of opinion. It's perspective and opinion, right? That white privilege is a thing, let's say. But that also is linked to, have you been educated, or are you aware of certain things, And dialogue and discussion will bring about an understanding of those things, but shouting in people's faces tends to not really work. Or at least most of us don't like having something shouted in our face that we didn't choose and told it's a problem. But would you watch a Lord of the Rings remake where there are minorities set in just for the sake of it, says McClowan. I mean, that's kind of controversial, right? When you remake something and try and offset what the original had wrong with it from a societal perspective. So with something that's very fantasy oriented, like Lord of the Rings, that's particularly an odd one to try and dissect. But I watched Hamilton recently, right? And that was really quite fantastic. Musicals are not my thing. It did at a point kind of, for me, just get like, okay, another song. Like, I love music. If I loved the style of musical songs like I do regular stuff that I listen to, I mean, I would have been all over that. But I really appreciated everything it was about. Also, first couple of minutes in, I'm like, I know that voice. It's the guy from Clipping is in it. I think his name is Daryl Deegs or something. Anyway, like, after a while, it kind of hit me that, okay, yeah, hip-hop is like the musical orientation here. You got your beats and your rhymes, and it's really impressive. But the cast is of, minority races, majoritively. And, like, I think the point to focus on there is that it doesn't really affect the art in any way. So if you had... Oh, David Diggs is the name. If you had, a load of people of colour playing the characters in Lord of the Rings, right? Tolkien was a white author in a white world, probably had not a lot of exposure to other countries from a different time. All his characters are blatantly going to be white. But, like, does it really make much of a difference? Like, all of this stuff's supposed to be skin deep, right? So if you have a bunch of black elves running around, at the end of the day, it's the story, it's the characters that count, and that stuff is just skin deep. So I just wouldn't have a problem with it, but I understand how it becomes problematic when someone recreates something to change the cast. Like, recently there was a remake of Ghostbusters with all women, and I can't help but feel like that could just be a thing. Oh, we're remaking it, but we've got women this time. Cool, sort of turned something on its side, but it got framed in a sort of social justice movement kind of direction, and then that makes people angry, right? Also, apparently the movie was pretty bad, like, not because there were women in it, but just because it was poorly done, which doesn't help it as well, because if you make something that's really good, it's hard to deny when something's really good, right? But again, like, the point being is that, like, it's not who's the cast that matters, is the movie good? So when it's not good, it kind of makes it easier for people to get upset about stuff like that. But when something is good, it becomes less of a problem. Like, in everything I've heard about Hamilton, no one had mentioned that the cast, which blatantly would have been white, to be historically accurate, was not. And it's not a problem. And that's probably because the show is really, really good. And then it diverts people's mind. But if it weren't that good, then people would probably start paying attention to that. And like I said, it doesn't bother me. It's all nonsense. Like, the things that count in movies are not, oh, you're this skin colour, you're that skin colour. It's the stories and the emotions and the journey and all that kind of stuff, to me. I would say these movies have been made. There's no need to continue whining about those movies. Personally, it's better to work on these issues in future movies and learn from the mistakes. Yeah, it's the whining about the movies that's the problem, right? It's this coming in with this idea that, oh, this should be removed. Like, no, we should keep it. It tells us about our past. We shouldn't erase our past. We need to learn from it. We need to learn from the mistakes. And those things could still be enjoyed, but educating people, back then, society was different. You know, people were treated differently, and you can see it in this movie. It doesn't make the movie terrible because of that. It's just something to pay attention to. The movie is a product of the times. Each era of cinema kind of like ends up having a bit of a tone to it. Like, I love 90s movies. 90s movies always have this just easy spirit about them. They're really warm and easy to enjoy. You know, now in those movies you start to see some cracks of like ideas that aren't quite acceptable anymore. Like I mentioned earlier, like the really badly whitewashed cast that was just, you know, all white affluent people in the setting of the movie. But like, if we educate, then we understand. We don't have to remove these things. We can keep them and learn from them, essentially. But that's I guess just how I would do it if I were somehow in charge of what's culturally allowed or not.